Today's reading is the poem of the Empire by Mary Oliver. We will be known as a culture that feared death and adored power, that tried to vanquish insecurity for the few and cared little for the penury of the many. We will be known as a culture that taught and rewarded the amassing of things, that spoke little, if at all, about the quality of life for people, other people, for dogs, for rivers. All the world, in our eyes, they will say, was a commodity, and they will say that this structure was held together politically, which it was. And they will say also that our politics was no more than an apparatus to accommodate the feelings of the heart, and that the heart in those days was small and hard and full of meanness.
So good afternoon. It's good to be here with you. So the poem we heard was by Mary Oliver. And while she was not a Unitarian Universalist, she used to be considered the UU poet. I mean, for a time, it seemed like every other Unitarian Universalist service included a Mary Oliver poem. There were so many lovely poems about wild geese and hungry bears and dogs in dark woods, and their theologies, if poems can have theologies, aligned so well with Unitarian Universalism. So we used them a lot. And finally, some of us, myself included, just said no. Using Mary Oliver poems was too easy, so we stopped. But every now and then, her work still surprises us, or at least me, and this poem that we just heard was one of those surprises. Over this weekend, we celebrate pivotal Holy Weeks for two of the great Abrahamic religions. Wednesday night was the start of the Passover week for the Jews, and today is Easter Sunday, the culmination of Holy Week for Christians. Now, the Jewish time of Passover re-examines the Exodus story in the Bible, that is, the escape of the Hebrew people from brick-making slavery and oppression in Egypt to freedom in their own land. Exodus is the archetypal story of possibility, of freedom, of escape from a hard-hearted tyrant or Pharaoh. It was the story sung, Exodus is a story sung by slaves in America. It remains the go-to story for oppressed people even today. The Christian story of Easter is also kind of a story of possibility, though quite a different one. It's a story of transition from utter despair to domination. Bible historian Bert Ehrman opens his book, How Jesus Became God, with these lines, which sum up the story nicely. He says, Jesus was a lower-class Jewish preacher from the backwaters of rural Galilee who was condemned for illegal activities and crucified for crimes against the state. Yet not long after his death, his followers were claiming he was a divine being, and eventually they went even further, declaring he was none other than God, Lord of heaven and earth. Now, these two stories are connected, of course. Jesus went to Jerusalem for Passover. That's what all Jews were expected to do in those times. It was in Jerusalem that he stirred up trouble with the religious authorities, and the Last Supper was likely a Passover Seder, which is why the two holy days typically overlap each other most years, but not all years, given the difference between how the Jews and the Christians keep their calendars. But both the Passover and the resurrection stories speak of freedom from oppression, of release and triumph, but they are vastly different stories. Passover, and in fact the whole Exodus story, is a communal story. It's a story of a people trying to stay together, bickering, disagreeing as they wander around in the wilderness for 40 years, but somehow remaining together. As a community, the people are able to realize the dreams denied their forebears, and they enter the promised land. Now, whether this story is historical or not, whether even little bits of it are factually true, it's not important. What is important are the messages behind the story, and there are multiple, about a people's relationship with their God, about God's power, about resistance to oppression, and the courage to be free, among others. It's a story of possibility, a reminder that things don't have to stay the same, that oppression can be overcome, and that escape from bondage is possible. The Easter story, however, speaks of an individual, a human who is killed by the empire, but also rises, returns, and prevails, becoming divine. If anything, this is an archetypal, heroic story where an individual is on a mission and they fail profoundly, and in fact, he dies while pursuing that mission. Game over. But according to the story, he overcomes that failure and returns to continue the mission. Again, whether this story is historical or not, whether or not even little bits of it are true, that's not important. What is important are the messages behind the story. Again, these are multiple. How can a person can stand up to oppression and empire, courageous even to death? How that person can prevail, even returning to life after death. How God promises to replace an imperial kingdom with God's own kingdom with eternal life for all who believe. Again, it's a story of possibility in which the worst possible outcome, death of your spiritual leader, is reframed into something far more hopeful and optimistic. Now, in my earlier days, I found myself rather annoyed at both of these stories. I didn't like the marketing spin that seemed to surround each version. Passover, a people in trouble, God helps them out, they get their freedom. Easter, a leader is killed, God helps him out, he comes back to life, all God, part of God's plan, right? Everything just seemed to ending to conveniently happily ever after. But some time ago, I discovered the work of Dan McAdams, a psychologist at Northwestern University, and he's a pioneer in the field of narrative psychology, or the psychology of stories. And McAdams finds that there are two major narrative scripts that people use in telling the stories from their lives. The first script is the redemption sequence. In these stories, a negative event, a failure, a loss, a struggle, is followed by a positive outcome that redeems the initial pain. So, for example, a person might describe a difficult divorce as a painful catalyst that finally allowed them to see their true self. The other script is the contamination sequence. In these stories, a positive event is contaminated by a subsequent negative turn. So a vacation story might start out well, but the narrator focuses only on the flight delays and the bad food, effectively wrecking the memory of the entire trip for everybody else around. And so when we look at both the Passover and the Easter story, we find out that each of them have been framed as redemption sequences. The Israelites, once slaves, become free. The followers of Jesus, despairing at his death, meet him again, and they are reassured that he will return to free them from oppression and establish a new order. My annoyance at these two stories has also been tempered by reading the work of psychologist David Destino in his book, How God Works. And he has explored the science behind religion. He has suggested that religions evolve in competition with one another, evolution at work, and that this evolution forces them to adopt beliefs and practices that help their adherents. So a lot of religious beliefs help people find meaning in their lives. And a lot of religious practices help people navigate the hard times and the losses in life. So according to DeSteno's perspective, even a lot of stuff we do here at LCUUF, think joys and sorrows, think singing together, think taking an offering and then giving it away. These things help us to become more deeply connected with each other. And in the same way, there's a good reason both Judaism and Christianity reframe Passover and Easter to be redemptive stories. Such stories help their people psychologically. People want to feel like the religion they belong to has gotten its act together and is going places, so they feel more supported by such religions. So Passover and Easter are about hope and possibility because they are redemption stories. That's what those religions needed to survive. So the question for us might be, what's our redemption story? Do we have one? Do we need one? I'm not sure. I don't think I have much to say about redemption. But I'm far more interested in a deeper question, which is this: what's possible for us? How might we be open to the possibilities of life? I mean, this is a question with a lot of possible answers, and I want to just explore one today. So I've been reading also the work of writer and activist Rebecca Solnit, and she has explored areas of social change, popular power, catastrophe, and hope, as well as climate change, which is where we're going today. In so doing, she considers topics like possibility and hope. Solnit reminds us that the future is unknowable and that we cannot be certain about what the future holds. But she notes, and I quote, "There is this Western and particularly American enthusiasm for certainty, whether it's based on truth or accuracy or not. People seem to really dislike uncertainty." So this unwillingness, this is Matt speaking, this unwillingness to accept the uncertainty in life is what creates problems. Certainty can be a bad thing. Solnit goes on, "I think of both optimism and pessimism, as well as despair, as forms of certainty about the future. We know what's going to happen, is their assumption. Pessimists assume it's terrible, but they let themselves off the hook from doing anything at all because they speak as if the future has already been decided. Optimists take the opposite position, but with the same kind of certainty, that everything will be fine. Nothing is required. I think part of it is that uncertainty is unnerving, because certainty is predictability," end quote. But between the extremes of the impossible and the certain, there's a lot of room for possibility, even improbable, implausible possibility, if that can be a thing. So Solnit told the story of a dozen Quakers in 1770 who decided to abolish slavery in the British Empire. She said it was a radical thing to decide, and it was so implausible. She notes that only one of those Quakers lived long enough to actually see slavery abolished in the empire some 50 years later. That's a long wait. She mentions another example. The idea of giving women the right to vote began to be floated around in the 1840s, but it was seen as a ridiculous, illogical idea. It took 80 years of hard work to make that idea a reality. And in our own time, the climate crisis has been a topic of contention, and for many of us, despair. Last year was the second hottest year on record, beaten out by, well, 2024. On top of that, there has been some significant backsliding in climate progress, mostly in a certain country north of here. But the possibility of healing the earth, finding a redemption narrative on climate change is very real. Right now, renewable green energy sources account for just about half of the world's total electricity capacity. That is just amazing to me. And over 85% of new electrical capacity that's being added every year is renewable. And electric vehicles have developed strong momentum in most of the developed world, again with the exception of a certain country north of here. And further, I would say that even the violent actions of a certain country north of here may go to support these trends towards renewables. The attacks by the USA on Iran have resulted in high levels of oil and gas energy insecurity, which may accelerate transitions to renewable energy in many parts of the world. So there may be a possibility, the possibility of a healthy and restored earth emerging from this work, including the work of each of us, that each of us do. And finally, one thing that quite endeared me to Soulnet is what she says about beauty and joy and pleasure in the work of activism. Soulnet says, I think, first of all, if you're utterly miserable, you're usually a terrible activist. And you're oftentimes dragging down other activists around you. And that kind of self-denial often creates miserable activists, end quote. And I realize that's true for me. No, not that I'm miserable, although you may have a different opinion, but that I can really get dragged down by being surrounded by miserable, joyless, strident activists. I remember serving another church, and there was this one member who was heavily involved in many social justice issues. And I agreed with him on all of them, but I couldn't work with him. He was loud and angry, harsh and grating. And as a consequence, he became a loner, unable to work with me or others, and so he was ineffectual in his work. Instead, Soulnet encourages us to embrace joy in our work. She continues, second of all, I think you can lose sight of what we're fighting for. We want a world of beauty, joy, and abundance, and there is no reason we can't enjoy as much as possible those things along the way. I think there's a real danger, and I've seen it in a lot of hardcore left-wing activists of actually forgetting what the goal is, or imagining that the goal is some kind of justice without knowing that justice is beautiful and joyful, that justice should be kind of abundance. I think understanding how everything is connected is beautiful. Soulnet continues with a quote. She says, Paul Goodman famously wrote, suppose you had the revolution you are talking about. Suppose your side had won, and that you had the kind of society that you wanted. How would you live, you personally, in that society? Start living that way now. End quote. Or as Mary Oliver will tell us, don't hesitate. Here's her poem, Don't Hesitate. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give into it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb. Blessed be.